Scotland has more than 10,000 miles of coastline, and almost every mile of it has a fishing village on it, or the bones of one. Most of them are postcards now. A harbour wall, a row of painted cottages, a car park with an honesty box and a sign about puffins. The boats tied up in the water are plastic, with outboard motors and names like Sea Breeze, and they belong to people who fish for fun on a Sunday. The fishing, the real fishing, the kind that fed a village and drowned its men, is mostly gone. What's left is the picture of it, the look, the thing you photograph from the cliff top before you drive on to the next one. But here is the part nobody quite processes. In a small number of places along this coast, a boat went into the water this morning the same way it went into the water before the railway reached Scotland, before the photograph existed, before anyone in the village could have told you what year it was without checking. Not a reenactment, not a heritage weekend with men in costume, not a museum boat behind a velvet rope, a launch, hand, rope, beach, tide. Done the old way, because on some of these shores, the old way is still the only way that works. There is a smell to it that hasn't changed in 2 centuries. Tar and salt and diesel and rotting bladder wrack on the tide line. There is a sound, the long, grinding scrape of a wooden keel dragged down shingle to the water. And there is a method, old enough that the man who invented it has no name, no date, and no monument. He is just the first person who ever stood on a Scottish beach and worked out how to get a boat out past the surf and bring it home again. This list covers 10 places where that method survives, ranked from remarkable to almost impossible to believe. And I'll tell you now, by entry 1, the idea that fishing needs a harbour, an engine and a fish market to be real is going to feel like something you were told but never actually questioned. Because the question that runs underneath this entire list is a simple one, and it gets harder the further down we go. Is this tradition, or is it simply the only thing that has ever worked on a coast that refused to change? Keep that question in your head. We'll come back to it. Entry 10, Gardenstown, Aberdeenshire. On the Moray Firth, on the north coast of Aberdeenshire, in a fold of the cliff where a stream reaches the sea. The locals call it Gamrie. The map calls it Gardenstown. The village was founded in 1720 by a man named Alexander Garden, who put his own name on it and laid out cottages on a shelf of land between the cliff and the tide. By the turn of the 20th century, Gardenstown and its tiny neighbour Crovie, and we will come back to Crovie, supported something like 50 fishing boats and 250 fishermen between them, working off a shore with barely a flat yard to stand on. Here is the part that gives the place its weight. The history did not start with the fishing. There is the ruin of an 11th century chapel above the village, and according to local tradition, it was built to mark a battle fought near here in 1004 against a Danish raiding force, a fight remembered in the area as the Battle of the Bloody Pits. Whether the details of that battle are historically accurate is something historians treat with caution. What is not in doubt is that people have been launching boats off this exact piece of coast for a very, very long time, and that the launching was never the easy part. Because that is the trade-off at Gardenstown. The village is pinned between a near vertical cliff and the open North Sea, with almost no flat ground. Everything, the cottages, the path, the boats, had to fit into the space the geography allowed, which was almost none. You did not choose to launch your boat off a hostile, exposed shore. The shore was simply the only thing you had. And on a calm morning, with the Firth flat and silver and the gulls working the tide line, it is one of the most beautiful places in Scotland. On a bad morning, the same water that makes it beautiful is the thing most likely to kill you. Entry 9, Whinnyfold, Aberdeenshire. A little further down the same coast, at the southern end of Cruden Bay. Locally, it's pronounced something closer to Whinnyfold, which is the first clue that this is a place that has always belonged more to the people in it than to anyone passing through. The cottages you see today were built in the 1860s, on the cliff top, by fisher families who abandoned an older settlement about a mile inland and moved to the very edge of the sea to be closer to the work. And here is the detail that defines Whinnyfold. It has no harbour. None. There never was one. So the boats were kept below, on the rock, and the fishermen and their families scrambled up and down a steep grass slope to reach them, carrying gear down in the dark before dawn, and carrying the catch back up that same slope at the end of the day. Every fish landed at Whinnyfold was a fish someone hauled up a cliff by hand. Offshore lies a reef the locals call the Skares, a line of rock that has wrecked enough ships to earn a reputation that long outlasted the men who feared it. According to long-standing local law, the writer Bram Stoker, who holidayed nearby at Cruden Bay, drew on this stretch of brooding, dangerous coast in his fiction. Whether Whinnyfold specifically shaped any particular page is the kind of thing that gets repeated more confidently than the evidence allows. What's solid is the reef and the wrecks and the slope. The trade-off here is brutal in its simplicity. There was no harbour to make the work safe or the launch easy. The reward for living right on top of the fishing was that you paid for every single trip with your back and your knees and your nerve on a wet grass slope above the rocks. Entry 8. Catterline, Aberdeenshire. About 5 miles south of Stonehaven, near the great cliff fortress of Dunnottar Castle, a row of cottages sits along the top of a cliff above a small, exposed bay. The houses are built to follow the natural slope of the ground, stepping down the hill the way the land does, which already tells you this is a place that bent itself to the landscape rather than the other way around. Catterline was a fishing village in the 19th century, but its real fame came in the 20th through a painter. Joan, Eardley, one of Scotland's most important 20th century artists, first came here in 1950, and the village took such a hold on her that she eventually made it her permanent home. According to the well-told story, on her very first visit, before she had even seen the cottages, she stopped at the churchyard, found a gravedigger who cheerfully admitted he was digging up the wrong grave, and saw local children who had stuck a human skull on a pole. Her reaction, the story goes, was, "This is the real Shakespeare stuff. What a place to live." She painted the wild seas and the boats on this shore until her death in 1963. And here is the detail that matters for this list. In her paintings, you can see the boats pulled up on the beach on the west side of the pier. They were pulled up there because that is where the boat winch was, the capstan that hauled the boats up out of the reach of the North Sea. And according to people who know the village intimately, that winch is still there. The exact mechanism by which Catterline got its boats clear of a sea that would otherwise smash them is still standing on the shore. The trade-off at Catterline is the one Eardley spent her short life painting, the same wild weather that produced her greatest work. The storms, the spray, the elemental violence of the place was the daily reality of getting a boat up that beach. She found the wildness sublime. The fishermen found it a problem to be solved every single day with a rope and a winch and a great deal of effort. Entry 7. Pennan, Aberdeenshire. Back on the north Aberdeenshire coast, tucked beneath towering red sandstone cliff, is a single row of whitewashed cottages squeezed onto a ledge between the rock and the sea. About 50 dwellings. The name was first written down in 1587 as Pennand, and it's thought to come from an old Brittonic word meaning head or headland. The cottages here are built gable end onto the wind, turned sideways to the weather, because the storms that come in off this north-facing coast are ferocious enough that the houses had to be designed to take a beating and survive. And Pennan is famous, genuinely, internationally famous. But, and this is the entry's twist, not for fishing. In 1983, the director Bill Forsyth filmed much of his film Local Hero here, using Pennan to play a fictional village called Furness, where a tiny Scottish community is approached by an American oil company that wants to buy the whole place. The film became a classic, and the most famous object in it is a red telephone box on the seafront, from which the lead character phones America every night. Here is the detail that says everything. That red phone box was not real. It was a prop built for the film and removed afterwards. But fans of the film began arriving from all over the world to make a call from it, and were so disappointed to find it gone that, by public demand, a genuine working phone box was installed near the original spot. It has been a listed building since 1989. People still come from across the planet to photograph a phone box that exists because a film pretended it existed. So Pennan lives inside someone else's story, the same way the Castle of Corder lives inside Shakespeare's Macbeth. The trade-off is a strange, modern one. The village is now a conservation area, which means change is tightly controlled to preserve the look of a fishing village. Some residents have complained, in effect, that they are being made to live inside a museum of themselves, a preserved idea of a fishing village, maintained for the people who come to photograph it. And underneath all that, on the same exposed shore, the actual unglamorous business of getting a small boat in and out of a dangerous sea carries on, unfilmed. Entry 6. Footdee, Aberdeen. Locally, and forever, it's called Fittie. It sits on a spit of land at the very mouth of Aberdeen harbour, which means this entry is a fishing village that a city grew up around and then swallowed whole. Most Scottish fishing villages grew organically, scrambling up around whatever scrap of shelter the coast offered. Footdee did the opposite. It was planned. In 1809, Aberdeen's Superintendent of Public Works, the architect John Smith, laid out a purpose-built village to rehouse the city's fishing community out of the squalid harbour housing they'd been living in. He arranged it as neat squares of single-storey cottages, originally called, with no romance whatsoever, Fishtown. And here is the detail that survived everything. The cottages were built with their back to the sea, turned away from the storms to shelter the people inside. And throughout the 19th century, century, the fisher families built small outbuildings on the communal ground in the middle of the squares, facing their front doors, sheds for storing net, line, sails, and gear, soaked and blackened with the tar used to waterproof everything. They're still called the tarry sheds. Every cottage now has one, and they have become a riot of personal, eccentric, decorated little buildings. But their origin is purely practical. They are where a fishing life was stored when it wasn't out at sea. The name itself, incidentally, isn't even what everyone assumes. Footdee sounds like foot of the Dee, the river it sits beside, but historians believe it's actually a worn-down corruption of an old dedication to a saint. The village has been here, under one spelling or another, since at least 1398. The trade-off at Footdee is the strangest on the list so far. The fishing village did not lose to the sea, or to a storm, or to abandonment. It lost to the city. Aberdeen became one of the great oil ports of the North Sea, and the harbour that the fisherfolk launched their boats into is now full of enormous supply vessels servicing offshore rigs. Footdee survives as the small, stubborn, human-scaled rhythm of an old way of life, still standing in the literal shadow of the industry that replaced it. And here is where the list shifts. Everything you've heard so far, Gardenstown, Whinnyfold, Catterline, Pennan, Footdee, survived the old way of launching because geography left no choice. There was no flat ground, there was no harbour. The cliff and the tide dictated the method, and the method endured because nothing easier was possible. From this point on, that changes. From here, every entry is a place where the old launch survives, not because it has to, but because somebody chose it, refused to give it up, rebuilt the boat, kept the method alive when the easy modern alternative was sitting right there. The question stops being, what does geography force, and becomes, what does a person hold on to on purpose, long after the reason for it has gone. Entry 5, Auchmithie, Angus. 3 miles north of Arbroath, a village sits on top of a red sandstone cliff, roughly 120 feet above a shingle beach. To get a boat to the water, you went down. To bring the catch home, you came back up. First recorded in 1434, with origins that may reach back to Norse settlers 1,000 years ago, Auchmithie was, until the early 20th century, one of the busiest fishing villages in the whole district of Angus. It is also the true birthplace of one of Scotland's most famous foods, the Arbroath Smokie, a haddock hot smoked over hardwood in a particular way that, by law, can now only carry the name if it's made within about 8 kilometres of Arbroath. The Smokie did not start in Arbroath. It started here, in Auchmithie, made by fisher families over barrels sunk into the ground. When much of the village's population relocated to Arbroath in the 19th century, drawn by a better harbour, they took the recipe with them, and the world gave the credit to the town, not the village that invented it. But the detail that belongs on this list is older and stranger than the Smokie. Before Auchmithie had a proper harbour, and one wasn't built until 1889, the boats were launched straight off that beach below the cliff. And according to firmly held local tradition, the fishwives of Auchmithie used to carry their husbands out to the boats on their back, wading into the cold North Sea, so that the men would begin a long day's fishing with dry feet. Whether that was true of every launch or just the worst of them, the image is documented again and again in Victorian accounts of the village, the women carrying the men to the water. The trade-off at Auchmithie is a quiet injustice. The village did the hardest part, invented the Smokie, worked the most punishing beach launch on this coast, carried its men to the sea on the backs of its women, and then watched the fame, the harbour, and the name move 3 miles down the road to Arbroath. Auchmithie kept the cliff, the shingle, and the labour. It gave away the glory. Entry 4, Westray, Orkney. Now we leave the mainland. Westray is one of the northern islands of Orkney, a place of green farmland ending in spectacular vertical sea cliff where seabirds nest in their thousands. It has Norse settlement layered into its ground and archaeological sites reaching back thousands of years. And it gave its name to a specific kind of boat, the Westray Yole, a beach-launched open fishing boat that took its mature form in the late 1800s. That word, yole, is one you're going to hear 3 times before this list ends, so it's worth understanding. A yole is a clinker-built boat, built shell-first, plank-overlapping plank, a method of boat building that is itself a direct inheritance from the Norse longships that came to these islands more than 1,000 years ago. These were open boats, built to be launched off a beach and rowed or sailed, designed for the specific waters of the specific island that built them. And on islands like Westray, that beach launch was not a quaint choice. It was the entire logic of survival. The island fed itself from the sea, and the only way to the sea was to put a boat down a beach and bring it back up again, by hand, in whatever the North Atlantic was doing that day. The trade-off on Westray is the oldest one on this list. Isolation, as both the protection and the price. The same remoteness that kept the island's traditions intact, kept the yole, kept the launch, kept the old knowledge of how to read these waters, is the same remoteness that made every storm more dangerous and every emergency further from help. You were self-reliant because there was no alternative. The boat on the beach was not a hobby. It was the line between the island and the rest of the world. Entry Entry 3, Stroma, Pentland Firth. Between the very top of the Scottish mainland and the Orkney Islands runs a narrow strait called the Pentland Firth, and it contains some of the strongest tidal currents in the world. Water moves through here fast enough to throw up standing waves and whirlpools that have terrified sailors for 1,000 years. In the middle of that violence sits a small island called Stroma. The island bred its own boat to survive it, the Stroma Yole. And here you can see very precisely how a launch and a boat are shaped by the water they have to live in. The Stroma Yole was built heavier and more barrel-chested above the waterline than its Orkney cousins, with extra planking for more freeboard, because anything lighter would have been swamped or smashed in the Firth seas. It was, in the words of those who studied it, a direct descendant of the old Norse longship. The fishing itself was extraordinary. The islanders hand-lined for cod in some of the fastest water in Britain, and to do it, the rowers had to hold the boat dead still against currents that wanted to drag it away, baiting their hooks with limpets, working a tide race by sheer skill and muscle. And here is the documented fact that defines Stroma for this list. As late as 1894, the island had no proper landing place at all, which meant the boats were landed directly on the beach and hauled up above the waterline by hand every time they came home from the most dangerous water in the country. But here is the honest part, and this is exactly the sort of thing this channel doesn't skip. Stroma is empty now. The last families left in the 1960s, and the island today is uninhabited. Sheep, ruined cottages, and the wind. The living tradition died with the community, and yet the yoles survived. Boats like the Bee, launched in 1904 and worked from Stroma, still exist, and one of them is now the centre of a restoration and training project where Scottish schoolchildren are learning to rebuild a Pentland Firth yole by hand, plank by plank. So the trade-off at Stroma is the heaviest one yet, and it sharpens that question we've been carrying. The launch survives, but the launchers are gone. The method is being kept alive by teenagers in a boatyard, restoring a boat their great-grandparents' generation rowed into the worst water in Britain. Is that the same launch, or is it a memory of one, lovingly rebuilt? Hold that thought for one more entry, because the next village answers it. Entry 2, Ness, Isle of Lewis. At the far northern tip of the Isle of Lewis, in the Outer Hebrides, is a district called Ness, and it built a boat so distinctive it has its own name, the Scoth Nysiach, the Ness skiff, another clinker-built descendant of the Norse boats, large and open and built for the wild Atlantic waters off the most exposed coast in Scotland. And the way these boats were launched and worked contains the single most beautiful detail on this entire list. The Scoth was beach-launched, and once it was afloat, the crew loaded it with ballast, stones gathered from the shore, to settle it properly in the water and steady it for the open sea. Then they went out and fished, and as the catch came aboard, as the boat filled with fish, the crew threw the ballast stones back into the sea. The weight of the stones was replaced, pound for pound, by the weight of the fish. The boat went out heavy with stone and came home heavy with herring. A good day's fishing was, quite literally, a boat that had swapped the dead weight of rock for the living weight of the catch. By the 20th century, this way of fishing was dying. The last original working Scoth, a boat called Jubilee, was launched in 1935, the very last of her kind built to actually go to the line fishing. The fleet dwindled to almost nothing. And then, and this is the answer to the question Stroma raised, the people of Ness refused to let it end. Jubilee was restored as a community sailing boat, and in 1994, a full-size 33-foot replica Scoth named Anne Sulaire, the Gannet, was built by hand in Stornoway. These boats are now sailed and crewed by a community boat trust, taking ordinary members of the public out onto the same water, in the same kind of boat, launched broadly the same way, that fed this coast for centuries. So this is the trade-off at Ness, and it's a profound one. The launch here survives as a deliberate, funded, communal act of refusal. Nobody in Ness needs to launch a Scoth to eat tonight. They do it because a community decided that letting the method die would be a kind of death itself, and so they built a new old boat by hand, on purpose, and put it back in the water. That is not survival by accident of geography. That is survival as a choice, made by a whole community, generation after generation. Entry 1, Crovie, Aberdeenshire. We end where Entry 10 began, back on the Moray Firth, 15 miles west of Fraserburgh, in the tiny twin of Gardenstown, a village called Crovie. And it is, I'd argue, the closest thing left in Scotland to a fishing village frozen at the moment the modern world arrived and simply couldn't get in. Crovie is a single row of cottages huddled below sheer cliff, on a ledge so narrow that the houses stand gable end to the sea, packed so tightly together that there is no room for a road. None. The only way through the village is a footpath of boulders and concrete that runs in front of the houses, and that path doubles as the seawall, the thing standing between the cottages and the North Sea. You cannot drive here. To this day, residents park their cars in a car park up on the cliff top and walk down, and goods, shopping, building materials, everything, are still moved through the village by wheelbarrow, because a wheelbarrow is the largest vehicle that fits. And the detail that makes Crovie the #1 entry on this list is this. There is essentially one flat, grassy spot in the entire village, and that spot is where the boats are pulled up out of the sea. The harbour, such as it is brutally exposed, sheltered by a single breakwater against the full force of the Firth. There is no slipway worth the name, no road to the water, no machinery between the boat and the man hauling it. The launch is not a feature of the village. The launch is the only thing the geography permit, and everything else, the path, the wheelbarrows, the houses turned sideways to the wind, exists around it. And here is where I want to bring in the old knowledge, the customs recorded along this exact coast, in these exact villages, before anyone thought to write them down kindly. When the boats were launched off the beach, they were pushed into the water stern first. The prow was always turned seaward, in the direction of the sun's course across the sky. A horseshoe was nailed to the boat, usually to the mast, and the most prized of all was the shoe from a waith horse, a horse that had pulled drowned things from the sea. When a new boat came to the village, the skipper's wife would take a lapful of corn or barley and sow it over the hull like a blessing on a field. A fisherman, asked on his way to the boat where he was going, would not answer plainly for fear of inviting disaster, and no one whistled at sea. That is the texture of the thing. Not just a method, but a whole world of belief wrapped around the simple, terrifying act of putting a small wooden boat into a sea that took men every year. The trade-off at Crovie is the heaviest on the list, because at Crovie, the launch is not one task among many. The launch is the life. You do not casually fish from Crovie, you submit to it. The village offers you no road, no shelter, no machinery, and no shortcut. It offers you a ledge, a footpath, a wheelbarrow, one flat patch of grass, and a seawall that is also your front path. To live here and put a boat in the water is to do it the way it was done 200 years ago. Not because you're preserving anything, but because Crovie has never once allowed it to be done any other way. And so we arrive back at the question, is this tradition, or is it simply the only thing that has ever worked? At Crovie, the answer is both at once, which is exactly why it's #1. The method survives here in its purest form precisely because the place was too small, too steep, and too stubborn for the modern world to ever fit inside it. Why almost every other village stopped Scotland has more than 10,000 miles of coastline, and it is lined with the ghosts of fishing villages, places where the boats no longer launch the old way, or no longer launch at all. And the reason most of them stop is not what you'd guess. It was not the sea, it was not storms. The old launch did not lose to the weather. It lost to economics and to convenience. It lost to the steam trawler, which could fish further, longer, and in greater quantity than any beach-launched open boat. It lost to harbour consolidation, to a handful of big, sheltered ports like Fraserburgh and Peterhead, absorbing the work of 100 tiny exposed beaches. It lost to the collapse of the great herring fishery that had been the engine of the whole coast. It lost to the road and the railway, and, eventually, the supermarket, which meant a village no longer had to feed itself from the water in front of it. And it lost to fishing quotas and regulation that made the small, marginal, hand-launched operation simply not worth the danger. The old launch was never beaten by the sea, it was built to survive. It was beaten by the fact that there was, finally, an easier way, and most people, reasonably, took it, which is what makes the 10 places on this list extraordinary. Gardenstown and Whinnyfold and Crovie survived the old way because the cliff refused the new one. Catterline kept its winch on the shore. Footdee kept its tarry sheds in the shadow of an oil port. Auchmithie kept the beach that the Smokie's fame left behind. Westray and Stroma kept the Norse boat that the islands shaped. And Neth, most deliberately of all, rebuilt the old boat by hand and put it back in the water, not because anyone needed it to eat, but because a community decided the method was worth more than its convenience. That is the thread connecting all 10. Somewhere in each of these places, somebody decided that the way the boat goes into the water mattered more than the easier way it could go. Sometimes the cliff decided for them. Sometimes they decided for themselves against every economic argument in the world. But the result is the same. A boat went into the water this morning the same way it went in before the photograph was invented, before the railway, before the men who do it could have told you what year it was without checking. These villages are not remarkable because they are old. Plenty of things are old. They are remarkable because this morning, on a handful of Scottish beaches, the keel still scraped the shingle, the prow still turned toward the sun, and the oldest working method on this coast did the one thing it has always done. It went out and it came back. If you've ever stood on one of these shores at dawn and felt the thing you couldn't quite put into words, the weight of a method older than the country it belongs to, the silence between the scrape of the keel and the first stroke of the oars, tell me about it in the comments. I want to know which shore it was and what it taught you. And if this showed you a Scotland you didn't have before, not the postcard, but the working coast underneath it, consider subscribing. We cover the history that surface level content skip, not because because it's obscure, but because it only gives up its meaning if you sit with it long enough to understand what it actually cost.